The story opens in the soft, exhausted light of a Neapolitan afternoon, where the sea murmurs against the harbor walls and the air carries the scent of salt, cigarette smoke and distant traffic. In a modest apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples, an aging man stands by the balcony, his silhouette framed against the fading gold of the sky. His suit is immaculate, his hair slicked back with the same discipline he practiced decades ago, yet his hands tremble ever so slightly as he lights a cigarette. This man, once the most powerful crime figure in the Western Hemisphere, now lives as a ghost in exile. Salvatore Lucky Luciano. The king of American organized crime, reduced to a shadow watching boats drift in the water like memories he can no longer control. For years he ruled New York's underworld with a businessman's mind and a dictator's cold efficiency. He rebuilt the mafia from scattered, warring tribes into a corporation, a machine that outlived him. But now, as he stares at the distant horizon, it isn't power he sees, it's the fading echo of a kingdom he can no longer touch. Every sunrise reminds him of a city that once knelt to him. Every sunset reminds him that he cannot go back. He lives here in enforced exile, deported after World War II, labeled too dangerous to remain in the United States. The Americans ripped him from the empire he created, sent him to a country he barely remembered, and left him to drift between nostalgia and paranoia. Naples is warm, loud, alive, but for Luciano it is a golden cage. The locals whisper his name with fascination, the police shadow him with suspicion, and the government watches him like he is a foreign agent. His days pass in a haze of luxury hotels, quiet cafes and late-night walks along cobblestone streets. Yet beneath the calm surface lies a man carrying the weight of decades of war, alliances, betrayals and decisions that reshaped the criminal world forever. Inside him, two forces battle endlessly. The pragmatic boss who sees the world as a chessboard, and the older man searching for meaning in the ruins of his own life. Every decision he ever made, every deal, every betrayal, every murder he sanctioned, led him here to this borrowed apartment in a foreign land, where he lives under constant surveillance. He still carries himself like royalty with the posture of a man who commands loyalty by instinct, but the empire he once ruled has evolved without him. New leaders rise, new wars erupt, new money flows. His influence survives, but his hands can no longer touch the machinery. He spends long nights replaying his past, sometimes with pride, often with regret. The commission he built still governs the American mafia. The alliances he forged still shape criminal networks across continents. But the world has changed and he knows it. He watches young tourists pass beneath his window, laughing freely, living lives untouched by the weight of power. He watches businessmen cut deals over espresso in the cafes he frequents. And he listens to old Sicilian men share stories of loyalty, honor, and survival, stories that remind him of the rules he once lived by, rules he helped rewrite. Occasionally he is visited by old associates, men who still see him as a legend. They arrive with caution, glancing over their shoulders, carrying whispers from New York, Havana, Palermo. They tell him about new bosses, new fortunes, new crimes. Some seek his advice. Some simply want to bask in the presence of a man who defined an era. But each visit is a reminder that he is both revered and obsolete, a king whose throne has been taken by time. He walks the narrow streets at dusk when the light softens and the shops close, and he blends into the background like an ordinary old man. But inside his mind, the streets of Manhattan still come alive. The neon glow of Times Square in the 1930s, the smoky back rooms of nightclubs, the tense meetings in hotel suites, the heartbeat of a city he once controlled. He remembers the sensation of being unstoppable, and the realization much later that no one truly is. His exile is more spiritual than physical. The Americans wanted him gone, the Italians never wanted him back, and the world he built now functions without him. He is trapped between countries, between eras, between identities. Too American for Italy, too Italian for America. Too powerful for freedom, too old for war. And yet, he still feels the pulsing need to be part of the game, a need that has never left him. On certain nights, when the sea breeze carries the distant sound of boat horns and the city quiets into a gentle hum, Luciano sits alone in his armchair, staring at a photograph of himself as a young man in New York. The sharp suit, the confident smile, the eyes glowing with ambition. He wonders if that young man would recognize the figure he has become. He wonders which version of himself the world will remember. This is where the final chapter of Lucky Luciano's life begins, not with violence or grandeur, but with reflection, isolation, and the desperate desire to remain relevant in a world moving beyond him. The final kingdom he rules is not the American mafia, but the fragile empire of memory, influence, and unfinished business that follows him like a shadow. In the years after Lucky Luciano's deportation, New York's underworld became a kingdom without its architect. A machine still running, but altered by the hands that now maintained it. The empire he built did not vanish when he boarded the ship for Italy. If anything, it grew larger, richer, and more intricate. But without his presence, the rhythms changed. The temperature of the streets shifted. Men who once feared whispering his name now debated what the future would look like without him. Every corner of New York's criminal world still carried his fingerprints, yet the power that echoed through those streets no longer traveled back to him. In the dim bars of Little Italy, where cigarette smoke clung to the walls and neighborhood gossip passed like currency, older mobsters spoke of Luciano in the same tone priests used when mentioning fallen saints. They remembered the days when he could settle wars with a conversation, when his word mattered more than bullets. Under his leadership, the Mafia had become streamlined, a corporation with rules, boundaries, and a sense of hierarchy. It wasn't just crime, it was structure. Luciano had taken a chaotic world and turned it into an institution. But the structure he created also provided a blueprint for others to innovate, manipulate, and take advantage of once he was gone. The Commission, his greatest invention, still operated, still held meetings, still enforced peace among the five families. Yet its moral center, its guiding strategist, was now thousands of miles away. In his absence, the Commission felt less like a governing body and more like a table where ambitious men quietly sharpened knives under their jackets. The most striking change was the shift in personality among the family's leadership. Men who had once deferred to Luciano now positioned themselves as successors, rivals, or visionaries of their own criminal philosophies. Some believed in maintaining the balance Luciano created. Others wanted more violence, more control, more territory. The absence of a unifying figure meant the Mafia's new era would be shaped by competing visions, not a single architect. Frank Costello, the smooth-talking diplomat of the underworld, tried to preserve Luciano's spirit of negotiation. To him, power was best exercised quietly, through influence and political maneuvering. He used politicians instead of guns and judges instead of hitmen. He maintained the alliances Luciano left behind, keeping the money flowing and the peace mostly intact. But Costello's subtlety alienated the younger generation, who viewed diplomacy as weakness. Vito Genovese, on the other hand, embodied the darkness that Luciano had tried to suppress. Ruthless, ambitious, and patient, Genovese saw Luciano's exile as an opportunity to reclaim a throne he believed had always been his. He respected Luciano's intelligence but not his restraint. Genovese believed the Mafia should rule through fear, not cooperation. He believed violence was not a last resort but a tool of efficiency. Under his growing influence, the balance that Luciano once maintained began to crack. Even Meyer Lansky, Luciano's closest friend and the financial genius behind many of their shared ventures, recognized the changes. From Miami to Havana, Lansky could feel the old world slipping away. Luciano had been the one man capable of managing egos, smoothing conflicts, and controlling the temperature of the underworld. Without him, Lansky saw a future ruled by unpredictable men who lacked Luciano's vision. He admired Costello's attempts to preserve stability, but he also understood Genovese's hunger for dominance could not be contained forever. Ordinary gangsters felt the shift too. Bookmakers, union men, racketeers, and street-level soldiers noticed a rising tension in the air. They whispered about alliances breaking, about old grudges resurfacing. They remembered how Luciano had handled disputes with a mix of charm and threat, always ensuring violence never spiraled out of control. Now disputes lingered longer. Paranoia sharpened. Men looked over their shoulders more often. Meanwhile, law enforcement sensed opportunity. Luciano's name had once terrified not just criminals but also prosecutors. They believed he was untouchable, too smart, too connected, too insulated by layers of loyalty. With him gone, federal agencies gained confidence. They watched the families more closely, infiltrated unions more aggressively, and pursued cases they once considered pointless. Without Luciano's strategic oversight, some mobsters became sloppy, arrogant, or reckless. The FBI noticed. Even judges and politicians felt the void he left. Many of them had secretly benefited from Luciano's empire: campaign donations, votes guaranteed by unions he controlled, favors exchanged in private backrooms. Luciano ensured these relationships stayed consistent, profitable, and discreet. Now, the political underworld was more chaotic, with multiple bosses offering money and influence in exchange for protection. Some politicians welcomed the competition. Others missed the simplicity of dealing with one supreme figure. Outside of New York, the landscape shifted as well. Havana, which Luciano helped transform into a criminal paradise, became more contested. European traffickers and Sicilian intermediaries debated whether the Americans still followed Luciano's rules. Even the French connection, the emerging heroin pipeline, felt the effects of his absence. The international world of crime was growing, stretching beyond national borders, and the one man who understood how to connect those worlds was now isolated in Italy. Still, for all the chaos and ambition, the empire functioned. Money flowed. Nightclubs buzzed. Unions bent to the will of unseen hands. Gambling dens thrived. Prostitution rings expanded. The docks remained under mafia control. Luciano's blueprint was too strong to collapse quickly. But the cracks were visible, small fractures at first, then deeper divides. Men who had once been bound by Luciano's authority were now becoming kings in their own right. Some honored his legacy. Others tried to erase it. The streets no longer echoed with whispers of "Lucky said this," or "Lucky wants that." Instead, New York was becoming a battlefield of ideologies. Diplomacy versus brutality, collaboration versus domination, old values versus new ambitions. And all of it unfolded without Luciano witnessing a single night of it firsthand. Yet he felt it even oceans away. Every letter he received, every coded message, every whispered update delivered by a visitor told him the same truth. The world he built was no longer his. It was growing, evolving, mutating into something he could recognize only in pieces. The empire still stood, but its architect was gone, and the structure had begun to shift in ways that would shape the future of global organized crime long after his final breath. When Lucky Luciano first stepped onto Italian soil after decades in America, the air felt foreign to him, too warm, too still, too familiar in ways he could no longer understand. Italy was the land of his birth, but not the land of his identity. The Sicilian dialects sounded like echoes from a childhood he had long buried beneath the skyscrapers of Manhattan. The people looked like him, yet not one of them belonged to the world he had built. He arrived not as a returning son but as an exile, a man stripped of a throne he crafted with precision, blood, and brilliance. He was escorted off the ship with quiet ceremony, watched by guards who recognized his name but not his history. In their eyes he was a deportee, another unwanted American criminal. In reality he was a displaced king whose power still pulsed through the veins of New York, Havana, and beyond. But here in Naples none of that mattered. His past did not earn him respect, it earned him surveillance. The Italian government didn't welcome him so much as tolerate him. They had lobbied against his return, fearing he would bring American-style organized crime to their streets. When their objections failed, they prepared instead. Police assigned to observe his movements, intelligence officers ready to intercept his communications, and politicians eager to distance themselves from the most dangerous man in America. Luciano felt the shift immediately. In New York, he had walked with a confidence that bent the world to his will. In Italy, every step was watched. Every meeting noted. Every phone call recorded. The man who once operated on his own terms now lived under a magnifying glass. Freedom had become an illusion he could see but not touch. Yet Luciano did not complain. He had lived long enough to understand that power existed in perception, not geography. If he could not rule openly, he would rule from the shadows. If he could not return to America, he would build something new, something global, something untouchable. Exile was not an ending. It was a relocation. Still, the emotional weight of being torn from the country that had shaped him was impossible to ignore. He had grown up on the brutal streets of the Lower East Side, survived gang wars, reshaped the mafia, and negotiated with world leaders. America was where he truly became Lucky Luciano. Without it, he felt a piece of himself missing, a phantom limb that throbbed every time he heard updates from New York. Italian air could not replace the electric pulse of Manhattan nights. In the early days of his return, he wandered Naples the way an old general walks abandoned battlefields, with nostalgia, calculation, and the lingering ache of knowing the war had moved on without him. The city was beautiful but full of ghosts. Naples reminded him of Sicily, of childhood memories he had spent a lifetime burying. But it also reminded him of everything he had lost. The empire he could no longer touch, the relationships fractured by distance, and the identity he could no longer express openly. He chose to live first in simple quarters, then later in luxurious hotels, always maintaining an image of quiet elegance. He ordered tailored suits, frequented upscale cafes, and moved with the grace of a man who refused to let exile reduce him. Even here, even now, he carried the presence of a leader. His charm, sharp, dangerous, inviting, disarmed Italians who expected a hardened criminal. To them, Luciano looked more like a retired aristocrat than a mob boss. But beneath that polished exterior was a man weighing every move, every interaction, every possibility. Italy might not have been home, but it offered something America did not: proximity to Europe's growing narcotics markets. The world was changing, and Luciano intended to remain at its center. He studied the French seaports, the Sicilian smuggling routes, the post-war black markets thriving across the continent. Europe was a chessboard no one had fully mastered yet, and Luciano saw opportunity in every square. Adapting was not easy though. Italy's criminal landscape was fragmented, governed by old codes and local loyalties. The Sicilian mafia, the source of many of Luciano's earliest lessons, eyed him with suspicion. To them he was Americanized, a foreigner with too much ambition and not enough tradition. They respected his past, but they did not trust his methods. Some saw him as an asset. Others saw him as a threat. All of them watched him closely. Still, Luciano's charisma chipped away at resistance. He met with local bosses in quiet cafes, speaking to them with a mix of humility and authority. He listened to their grievances, their ambitions, their fears. He understood that influence was not won through intimidation alone. It was earned through understanding. Slowly, he positioned himself as a bridge between old-world structures and new-world possibilities. But for all the business potential, Luciano's personal adjustment remained turbulent. Italy felt both familiar and alien. The rhythms of life were slower, the nights quieter, the opportunities more subtle. He missed the sharp energy of New York, the constant movement of deals and decisions, the sense that every second mattered. In Naples, the days sometimes stretched endlessly, leaving him alone with his thoughts. A dangerous place for a man who had spent his life outrunning regret. Loneliness settled into his routine like smoke seeping into furniture. He was surrounded by people but connected to none. Visitors came and went. Associates whispered updates from across the ocean. Women shared his evenings, but none could follow him into the depths of memory where his true life remained. Exile was supposed to be a physical punishment, but the emotional reality was far more punishing. Yet even in isolation, Luciano's mind stayed sharp. He studied international news, memorized shipping schedules, and analyzed the shifting power structures of the underworld. If he could not return to the center of crime, he would strengthen the edges of it. Exile may have removed him from America, but it could not remove the one thing that defined him: his need to shape the world from behind the curtain. And so, his years in Italy began with contradiction. A man caught between two worlds, two identities, two destinies. One side of him longed for the streets of Manhattan. The other saw Europe as an unwritten future. Italy was not the life he wanted, but it was the life he had, and Lucky Luciano was not a man who wasted whatever life gave him. From the moment Lucky Luciano settled into exile, the shadows around him began to move with familiar rhythm. No matter how far he was from New York, people still gravitated toward him, out of loyalty, fear, nostalgia, or simply the magnetic pull of a man who had once controlled the most intricate criminal empire in the Western world. And in those early years of exile, as he drifted between Naples, Capri, and Rome, one truth became unmistakable. Lucky Luciano was not done shaping the underworld. Not by a long shot. He had lost the power of presence but not the power of influence. American newspapers wrote about him constantly, portraying him as a puppet master pulling strings from across the ocean. Prosecutors spoke his name in courtroom indictments even when there was no evidence he was involved. Rival mobsters blamed him for moves they didn't understand. And his loyalists still treated him as the invisible hand guiding the five families. Ironically, exile amplified his myth. The less people saw of him, the more power they imagined he still held. But what the world didn't realize was that Luciano himself was navigating the most delicate stage of his life. Every move had to be calculated. Every conversation had consequences. Every alliance came with risk. Italy was not America. The rules were different, the dangers quieter but no less lethal. If New York had been a jungle, Italy was a labyrinth. One wrong turn could leave him lost, exposed, or dead. Still, Luciano's brilliance lay not in brutality, but in adaptability. His first major decision in exile was to establish a secure base of operations. He moved into the Hotel Excelsior in Naples, a glamorous hideaway filled with wealthy tourists, foreign diplomats, and local elites. To the world, it looked like a natural choice for a sophisticated retiree. In reality, the hotel was a fortress of anonymity. The constant flow of visitors made surveillance difficult. The luxury gave him privacy. The staff, easily bought with generous tips, provided quiet loyalty. It was from these gilded rooms that Luciano began laying the foundation for what would become his final network of power. Not a kingdom built on violence and territory like the one he created in America, but something broader, something international. The world after World War II was changing rapidly. Borders were looser. Trade routes were shifting. Black markets were exploding. Narcotics, in particular, had become a global currency. And in that shifting landscape, Luciano saw opportunity. His first step was reconnecting with old allies. He reached out to Meyer Lansky, who remained the most financially savvy mind in the American underworld. Lansky wasn't just an ally, he was Luciano's mirror, the strategist who understood the long game. Their conversations, done through coded messages and carefully orchestrated intermediaries, revolved around Cuba, the Caribbean, and the mounting opportunities in the international drug trade. Lansky managed casinos, political investments, and financial pipelines. Luciano connected the European supply chain to American distribution networks. Together, they envisioned a criminal alliance that stretched across continents, greater than anything the Mafia had attempted before. But Luciano's plans required cooperation from more than just his old friends. The Sicilian Mafia, the roots from which American Mafia culture had grown, was undergoing its own metamorphosis. Many Sicilian bosses saw Luciano as a bridge to the lucrative American market. Others saw him as a threat, a foreigner disguised as an Italian, bringing American attention to their secretive operations. Luciano knew he needed their cooperation, but also understood that Sicilians did not trust easily. He approached them not as a king from abroad, but as a businessman offering mutual benefit. Meetings were arranged discreetly, in countryside villas, in seaside cafes, in dimly lit back rooms where silence was currency. Luciano spoke to the old dons with respect, acknowledging their traditions while carefully introducing ideas of modern expansion. He emphasized partnership, not dominance. Money, not ego. Strategy, not chaos. Slowly, the old guard began to warm to him. They realized that Luciano was not trying to control them, he was trying to connect them to a world they had only glimpsed. Young Sicilian mafiosi, however, admired him openly. They saw in him a vision of the future, an underworld built on intelligence rather than brute force, on globalization rather than isolation. To them, Luciano was the man who had broken the old mafia code and rebuilt it into a business empire. They hung on to his words, watched his moves, studied his philosophies. These young men would later play major roles in the heroin trade that swept through Europe in the 1950s and 60s. But as Luciano extended his influence, others began to take notice, and not favorably. Vito Genovese, his longtime rival, saw Luciano's activities as an intrusion into his own ambitions. Genovese had worked tirelessly to seize power in New York after Luciano's exile. The last thing he wanted was the ghost of Lucky Luciano interfering from Italy. He sent warnings, veiled threats, and even attempted to cut off Luciano's access to the American families. But Luciano was too respected, too feared, too essential to be erased. His advice still carried weight. His approval still mattered. Genovese may have controlled the streets of New York, but Luciano controlled the psychology of the underworld. Meanwhile, American authorities feared that Luciano was rebuilding an empire from overseas. They pressured the Italian government to keep him under strict surveillance. Police followed him openly, hoping to intimidate him. Intelligence officers monitored his mail and intercepted his calls. But Luciano had spent a lifetime moving in shadows. He knew how to anticipate surveillance, how to communicate through layers of misdirection, how to make plans that looked like coincidences. Despite the pressure, his influence continued to grow. He became a symbolic leader, a patriarch of a criminal world expanding far beyond city borders. Men traveled from France, Turkey, Germany, and South America to meet with him. They came seeking partnerships, advice, or simply the honor of shaking the hand of the man who had revolutionized organized crime. Some left with alliances. Some left with warnings. All left knowing they had met a figure whose mind still shaped the world they inhabited. Yet this expanding influence came with a price. Luciano was living in a country he didn't fully understand, surrounded by people he could not fully trust, and monitored by authorities who hoped he would slip. The world he was shaping was larger than ever, but his personal world was shrinking. He was alone more often than he wanted to admit. And at night, as he sat with a glass of Sicilian wine, overlooking the silent streets of Naples, he sometimes wondered whether power meant anything if he could no longer feel the pulse of the city he once ruled. Still he pressed on. Because influence was the last kingdom left to him, and Luciano had no intention of surrendering his crown even from exile. Luciano's work in exile depended on the careful cultivation of alliances, not just with old friends, but with a wide web of figures who could extend his influence without exposing him to danger. These were not casual acquaintances. They were men whose loyalty had been tested over decades, men who understood both the subtlety and brutality of power. Meyer Lansky remained his closest confidant, the financial genius who could translate Luciano's strategic vision into cold, hard profit. Lansky understood the value of patience and discretion, traits Luciano demanded from all those around him. Together they discussed not just money but strategy, influence, and the unspoken rules of the international criminal network that was slowly taking shape. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, represented the face of diplomacy within the American Mafia. He preferred negotiation to violence, persuasion to intimidation, and politics to brute force. Luciano relied on Costello to maintain stability among the five families. Letters and coded messages flew between Italy and New York, each carrying careful instructions, advice, or reminders of old agreements. Costello, ever loyal, kept the families in check, ensuring that the organization remained profitable and operational. Yet even he was careful, aware that power vacuums were dangerous, and that younger, more aggressive figures were eager to push boundaries. Then there was Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition was only matched by his cunning. Genovese had long envied Luciano's position and had patiently awaited the moment when he could seize control. Luciano knew Genovese's temperament well. He respected his intelligence but understood that his loyalty was transactional. Their relationship was a delicate dance of deference and threat. Luciano allowed Genovese to operate, but he kept a mental map of every move, every alliance, every potential betrayal. In this way, the Italian exile maintained influence without ever needing to confront Genovese directly. Luciano's network also included rising figures from Sicily and southern Italy, young men eager to modernize the old-world mafia traditions. These youths were fascinated by the American methods he had pioneered: structured hierarchies, coordinated crime across multiple cities, and the integration of legitimate businesses with illegal operations. Luciano's presence lent them credibility and insight. He mentored them carefully, aware that some would later become his most trusted operatives in the international heroin trade. Yet he also knew that mentoring came with risk. Each mentee could become a rival if ambition overcame loyalty. The alliances were not only with men of action but also with men of intellect and influence. Politicians, businessmen, and bureaucrats became part of the intricate web Luciano spun. He understood that organized crime in the post-war era was no longer merely about territory or violence. It was about systems, influence, and the control of information. By creating relationships that spanned continents, he ensured that even from exile he could influence decisions that affected not only the underworld but also the political and financial landscapes surrounding it. Luciano's communication methods were sophisticated and layered. He relied on trusted intermediaries, coded letters, and private meetings in neutral territories to convey instructions. Each message was carefully crafted to appear innocuous to outsiders while carrying specific operational guidance. The psychological dimension of these alliances was as important as the logistical. By maintaining a sense of omnipresence, Luciano instilled both loyalty and caution. Men obeyed not only because they respected him but also because they understood the consequences of defiance. Yet alliances were never static. Each relationship required constant attention, constant calibration. Some allies were motivated by profit, some by respect, some by fear. Luciano had to balance these forces, ensuring that no single person grew too powerful or too independent. He knew that even a trusted confidant could become a liability if left unchecked. The delicate equilibrium of loyalty, ambition, and fear was the true currency of power, a currency Luciano handled with unmatched skill. Betrayal was always a potential undercurrent in these relationships. Luciano understood that men who had once been loyal in one context could turn in another, especially when wealth or survival was at stake. His genius lay in predicting these shifts and creating systems that minimized their impact. By keeping his allies interconnected, reliant on one another, and aware of his enduring influence, he ensured that the machinery of his empire could continue even without his physical presence in New York. In Europe, Luciano's alliances took on a different character. The Sicilian mafia, fragmented and cautious, had to be approached with tact. Luciano combined respect for their traditions with pragmatic business sense, proposing ventures that benefited both parties. He did not command them, he persuaded them. Every meeting was a negotiation, every handshake a silent contract. Through these efforts, he built bridges between American and European criminal networks, creating channels that would later become vital for narcotics distribution. Despite the complexity, Luciano's personal charm and intellect made these relationships workable. He was a master of reading men, understanding their fears, their ambitions, and their psychology. His ability to balance respect and intimidation, generosity and threat, created a unique aura of authority that transcended borders. Even in exile, he remained a central figure in a world that depended on perception as much as reality. But maintaining these alliances was not without stress. Every decision carried potential repercussions, every delay could spark suspicion, and every misstep might embolden a rival. Luciano's nights were often spent alone, reviewing letters, mapping contacts, and imagining scenarios of betrayal and loyalty. The burden of leadership, even from afar, weighed heavily on him. Yet he embraced it, understanding that influence required constant vigilance, constant management, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Through these shadow alliances, Luciano continued to exert a level of control that few could comprehend. He shaped decisions, orchestrated operations, and guided the ambitions of men who could have toppled his legacy had they not respected his intellect and foresight. In exile, his empire had changed, becoming less about direct action and more about psychological influence, subtle manipulation, and strategic oversight. But its effectiveness remained undeniable. Men listened. Men obeyed. And Luciano, even from across the Atlantic, remained the unseen hand of the Mafia, quietly steering its evolution and ensuring that his vision endured. The world Luciano had built in America was already changing when he arrived in Italy, and it continued to evolve in ways both familiar and threatening. Even thousands of miles away, he could feel the shifts in the streets, the subtle tremors of power as new men rose to prominence. The young bloods who had grown up under his shadow were no longer content with loyalty alone. Ambition surged in their veins. Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Joe Prophesy. These names, once peripheral, were now spoken in the same breath as the old legends. Each man carried a different vision for the future, and none were willing to wait for Luciano's blessing. His empire, though vast and enduring, was no longer static. It was a living organism, capable of growth and decay, and he could feel its pulse from afar. Gambino represented the quiet, calculating type, the strategist who waited, watched, and struck with surgical precision. He admired structure, efficiency, and discipline, qualities Luciano had instilled across the 5 families. Yet Gambino also had a patience and ruthlessness that threatened the old guard. He could be a friend, a partner, or a competitor depending on the circumstances. Luciano recognized the need to manage such figures carefully. From letters, messengers, and occasional visits, he guided them subtly, never overtly, always ensuring that loyalty and fear remained in balance. The line between mentorship and manipulation was razor thin, and he walked it with the experience of decades. Joe Bonanno, by contrast, embodied ambition cloaked in charm. He had the charisma of a leader, the instinct for territory, and a hunger that refused to be ignored. Bonanno understood the importance of appearance, diplomacy, and political maneuvering, and he wielded influence in both the American and Italian networks. Luciano, while recognizing Bonanno's potential, also saw the seeds of conflict. A young, ambitious boss could disrupt decades of careful planning with a single miscalculated move. It was a reminder that an empire built on trust and fear must constantly be defended, even from the very people who swore loyalty to it. Joe Prophesy was another force, quietly amassing power while avoiding the attention that drew conflict. Where Bonanno and Gambino were active, Prophesy preferred patience, observation, and incremental control. Yet patience could be as dangerous as aggression. Luciano understood that Prophesy's type, slow, steady, calculating, could consolidate power while others battled openly, ultimately challenging the established order. Exile had removed him from immediate authority, but his mind remained alert to the subtle dynamics of influence, the chess moves invisible to those who underestimated him. The absence of Luciano's physical presence shifted the dynamics within the 5 families. Without his unifying force, old rivalries and ambitions surfaced. Conflicts that once would have been mediated under his watchful eye now erupted into violent confrontations or subtle power plays. Loyalty was tested not in words but in action, in the choices men made when his name was absent. It was a dangerous period for the organization he had built, and Luciano's ability to navigate it from afar would be a testament to his enduring intelligence. He also understood that influence could no longer rely solely on fear. The Mafia's younger generation respected brutality but demanded proof of competence and vision. To maintain relevance, Luciano had to project authority without being physically present. He did so through intermediaries, coded correspondence, and strategic intervention, subtly reminding everyone that his mind still guided the overarching structure of power. The perception of control became as important as control itself. The family's operations too were diversifying. Gambling, extortion, unions, bootlegging, the business had grown sophisticated, requiring coordination and foresight. Without Luciano, conflicts over profits and territories increased. Each family sought to assert dominance in key areas, testing limits and alliances. Yet the structure he had created allowed for negotiation, compromise, and resolution. The commission functioned as both court and council, a legacy of his insistence on order amid chaos. Even absent, his fingerprints were evident in the protocols, hierarchies, and operational norms that continued to govern behavior. At the same time, law enforcement had grown bolder. Federal agents noticed that Luciano's absence created cracks in the system. They pursued aggressive investigations, exploiting rivalries and encouraging informants. The streets were no longer under the same degree of coordinated oversight. While New York continued to generate revenue and power, the cracks were widening, and Luciano, ever vigilant, monitored them. Every report, every coded message, every whisper reached him. He assessed, adjusted, and advised. In a world evolving without him, he had become the invisible strategist, the unseen king guiding events from afar. The young bloods were learning lessons the hard way. Some respected the codes he left behind. Others sought shortcuts, challenging the old way of doing business. Violence flared in small bursts, reputations were tested, and alliances were fragile. It was a proving ground for leadership, an arena where the next generation would define the mafia's future. Luciano observed it all with a mixture of pride and caution, aware that the stability of the empire depended on the balance between ambition and order. International connections further complicated the picture. European traffickers, Sicilian mafiosi, and Caribbean operators had grown bolder, creating networks that transcended national borders. Luciano's influence was a thread connecting these disparate players, allowing him to guide operations indirectly. Yet this web was delicate. One misstep, one betrayal, one uncoordinated act could ripple through the system, undermining years of careful planning. It was a testament to his vision that, despite distance and opposition, he could still orchestrate movement across continents with precision. The psychological landscape was just as important as the physical. Men who had once deferred to him now tested boundaries, not out of disrespect but because absence invites challenge. Trust, loyalty, fear. These emotions were constantly shifting, and Luciano knew that to remain relevant, he had to manipulate perception as masterfully as he manipulated operations. A single letter, a subtle warning, or the reputation of omnipresence could keep even the most ambitious figures in check. In this way, the new generation of American mobsters became both the instrument and the test of Luciano's enduring influence. They were building, consolidating, and plotting, all within a framework he had designed but could not fully control. The contrast between his vision and their ambition created tension, drama, and risk. Yet it was precisely this tension that underscored his genius. He had built a system capable of self-regulation, but still flexible enough to allow for innovation, aggression, and the occasional act of rebellion. From his vantage point in Italy, Luciano watched this unfolding drama with the eyes of a general surveying a battlefield from a distant hilltop. He understood the stakes, the players, and the potential outcomes. And though he no longer walked the streets of New York, his influence remained, subtle, strategic, and psychological. The young bloods might have challenged him, tested him, and reshaped the empire he built, but he was never truly absent. He had created something that could not be destroyed by distance alone, an empire that continued to function according to his design, even as it evolved beyond him. Even in exile, Lucky Luciano never underestimated the importance of knowing both friends and enemies, and understanding how their ambitions and fears shaped the criminal landscape. Alliances were fragile, loyalties conditional, and every handshake carried potential deception. Power in the mafia was a psychological game as much as it was physical dominance, and Luciano, with decades of experience, had mastered both. From Naples, he monitored old associates, keeping track of who remained loyal, who grew ambitious, and who might betray him. In the intricate web of organized crime, every move of every player had consequences, and Luciano knew that maintaining influence required constant vigilance. Some of his most vital allies remained close, even from afar. Meyer Lansky continued to operate the financial backbone of the empire, ensuring that money flowed smoothly through casinos, unions, and investments in Cuba. Costello maintained peace among the American families, applying subtle pressure and diplomacy to prevent infighting that could destabilize the delicate balance Luciano had created. These men were trustworthy because they understood both the stakes and the value of loyalty, and because they knew that defying Luciano carried consequences beyond mere reputation. But where there were allies there were also rivals. Vito Genovese loomed as the most immediate threat to Luciano's legacy. Ambitious, ruthless, and strategic, Genovese had spent years plotting to consolidate power in New York, and Luciano's absence only accelerated his plans. He admired Luciano's intellect, yet he resented the lingering influence of a man who could not be touched physically but still dictated outcomes from thousands of miles away. Genovese's maneuvers were subtle, carefully orchestrated alliances, whispered threats, and targeted violence designed to destabilize opponents without drawing unnecessary attention from law enforcement. Luciano understood the stakes. He knew that Genovese would not hesitate to exploit any weakness, real or perceived. Every letter sent to New York contained precise instructions, reminders of boundaries, and coded guidance aimed at keeping the families aligned. At the same time, Luciano's communication was measured. He could not appear domineering from afar, lest he provoke rebellion. Influence, he knew, had to feel voluntary even when subtly enforced. The art of power was the art of perception. Beyond Genovese there were other ambitious figures testing limits. Carlo Gambino, though loyal, was quietly building networks and alliances that could one day rival the old order. Joe Bonanno, with charm and political acumen, sought to expand influence both in the U.S. and abroad. Prophesy remained patient, waiting for the right moment to assert himself. Each of these men was a variable in the complex equation of Luciano's empire, and he monitored them carefully. The environment in which these alliances and rivalries played out was dynamic and unpredictable. Street-level disputes, competition over gambling and narcotics, and the rise of new criminal enterprises added layers of tension. With Luciano absent physically, the commission became the governing authority, but even it could not fully control human ambition. Power vacuums emerged, and with them, opportunities for aggression and betrayal. In this climate, loyalty was as valuable as gold, and betrayal could be lethal. Luciano's genius lay not just in understanding individuals, but in understanding the psychology of networks. He recognized that even the strongest families depended on interconnections for stability, mutual interests, shared ventures, and common enemies. By nurturing these ties while keeping an eye on ambition and greed, he ensured that the system remained functional even in his absence. Influence became less about direct orders and more about shaping expectations, manipulating perceptions, and strategically rewarding loyalty. But the balance was delicate. Missteps could be fatal. Even men who had once been allies might be swayed by promises of power, wealth, or revenge. Luciano was constantly aware that the slightest lapse in oversight could ignite violent conflicts or fracture alliances. This made every decision calculated, every message intentional, every visit or intermediary carefully chosen. In Europe, these dynamics were amplified. Italian mafiosi, wary of American influence yet intrigued by Luciano's vision, required careful handling. Meetings had to be discreet, words measured, and intentions clear without appearing coercive. Young Sicilian operatives were eager to absorb his strategies, but older bosses resisted perceived intrusions. Navigating these relationships demanded psychological insight and strategic finesse, skills Luciano had honed over decades. Even in exile, he maintained a presence in Havana, where old networks of gambling, narcotics, and political influence were still active. Here, he used trusted intermediaries to manage operations, ensuring that both profits and authority continued to flow through channels he had established. These international alliances reinforced his relevance and reminded rivals that Luciano's mind extended far beyond physical boundaries. The duality of this period, allies and enemies, loyalty and betrayal, defined the final chapters of Luciano's power. While he could no longer rule openly, his strategic influence ensured that he remained a central figure in a complex, interconnected web of global organized crime. His ability to manipulate relationships, anticipate ambition, and balance competing interests solidified his enduring authority. Even in exile, Luciano's empire thrived, not just through fear or violence, but through psychological mastery and careful orchestration of every connection he had nurtured. This delicate balance between trust and tension became a defining characteristic of his final years. Friends remained loyal because they feared and respected him. Rivals were cautious because they understood his reach and intellect. In a world constantly shifting beneath him, Luciano's control was invisible but omnipresent, a testament to his enduring mastery of the art of alliances, the subtle architecture of loyalty, and the lethal calculus of power in the underworld. Even from exile, Luciano's life remained intertwined with the constant rhythm of conflict. The Mafia was not a static empire, it was a living organism, and where power existed, tension inevitably followed. The hidden war that simmered beneath the surface of the five families was invisible to the outside world, yet lethal to anyone caught unprepared. Luciano understood that true control required more than diplomacy or intimidation. It demanded an understanding of the subtle currents of ambition, fear, and deception that flowed through every city block, every speakeasy, and every boardroom of influence. In New York, the absence of its master strategist created opportunities for both cooperation and conflict. Rivalries long suppressed under Luciano's watchful eye resurfaced with renewed intensity. Men who had learned to operate within the boundaries he established now tested those limits, sometimes overtly, sometimes in carefully orchestrated maneuvers designed to expand their reach. Violence remained a constant threat, but the war was as often psychological as it was physical. Power struggles were waged in whispers, subtle threats, and calculated acts meant to unsettle opponents before confrontation became inevitable. Vito Genovese, in particular, emerged as a force reshaping the underworld. Ambitious and ruthless, he sought to consolidate power by exploiting every weakness in the existing hierarchy. Genovese was strategic, patient, and cunning. He understood that outright confrontation was risky without public support. Instead, he maneuvered behind the scenes, cultivating allies, intimidating subordinates, and exploiting rivalries. He understood that a slow, deliberate approach would achieve what a violent coup could not. For Luciano, Genovese's rise was a constant concern, a test of whether his influence, though distant, could still manage the ambitions of men like Genovese. At the same time, Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, and other emerging leaders were positioning themselves for influence. Gambino preferred careful, methodical consolidation, building alliances while avoiding unnecessary attention. Bonanno, with a keen sense for politics and diplomacy, sought to expand his territory both legally and illegally, blending the old-style American mafia approach with emerging post-war opportunities. These dynamics created a complex environment in which every decision mattered. One miscalculation could spark violent conflict, fracturing alliances, or exposing vulnerabilities that rivals could exploit. While the street-level disputes were dangerous, the hidden war extended into the realm of finance, unions, and politics. Luciano's absence left gaps in oversight that allowed for the rise of corruption, embezzlement, and subversive operations. Men who once deferred to him now acted independently, sometimes in ways that threatened the stability he had painstakingly established. From Havana to New York, illegal gambling dens, docks, and shipping routes became contested territory. Disputes that might once have been mediated by Luciano escalated in complexity and risk, threatening not just wealth but also lives. Law enforcement also sensed opportunity in this turbulence. Federal agents, emboldened by Luciano's absence, increased surveillance, leveraged informants, and conducted raids with renewed vigor. Organized crime was no longer a monolithic entity under a single guiding mind. It was a collection of competing factions whose rivalries and ambitions made them vulnerable to infiltration. Luciano had anticipated some of this, establishing mechanisms of oversight and communication, but distance always brought friction. Messages were delayed, instructions misinterpreted, and rivalries often outpaced the controls he had left in place. The psychological dimensions of the hidden war were as significant as the physical. Fear, respect, and ambition were constantly in flux. Men weighed their actions carefully, calculating the risk of defiance against the cost of loyalty. Luciano understood that control was no longer about commanding obedience directly, it was about managing perception. A hint of his continued influence could keep rivals cautious, allies cooperative, and subordinates in line. Even rumors of his interventions could stabilize conflicts, as men feared the repercussions of testing a strategist who might strike invisibly. Despite these tensions, the Mafia continued to operate as a functioning organization. Luciano's vision of structure, hierarchy, and the Commission as an arbiter of disputes endured. The framework he established allowed for negotiation, compromise, and enforcement without complete chaos. Yet cracks were visible. Subtle fractures in loyalty, rivalries forming where none existed before, and occasional outbursts of violence that reminded everyone that order was fragile. The empire was robust but vulnerable, a living system whose survival depended on the balance of human psychology and strategic oversight. Even abroad, Luciano monitored the international dimensions of this hidden war. Sicily, Havana, and Europe were increasingly interconnected with American operations, making conflicts global as well as local. Disputes over narcotics routes, political influence, and financial control were negotiated across oceans, with Luciano acting as an unseen mediator and strategist. Allies relied on him to resolve conflicts, while rivals were wary of his involvement. The hidden war was not only about survival, it was about positioning the Mafia for future dominance in a rapidly changing world. Luciano's genius during this period lay in his understanding of asymmetry. He did not need to be present to exert influence. His presence was psychological, a constant shadow that shaped decisions. He anticipated aggression, calculated loyalty, and maneuvered adversaries into positions favorable to his broader strategy. Through intermediaries, coded messages, and the careful orchestration of events, he maintained a level of control that rivaled his physical rule in New York. Ultimately, the hidden war demonstrated both the resilience and fragility of Luciano's empire. It revealed the challenges of leadership at a distance, the unpredictability of human ambition, and the power of perception in shaping outcomes. Violence, intrigue, and strategic maneuvering continued to define the underworld, but Luciano remained at its center, an invisible hand guiding events with precision and foresight. Even from exile, he shaped the battlefield, ensuring that the empire he had built not only survived but adapted to the evolving realities of post-war organized crime. The fall of Lucky Luciano began not with a single dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet erosion of his invincibility, a gradual shift in fortune that no man, no matter how cunning, could fully escape. For decades, he had operated at the pinnacle of organized crime, orchestrating operations, manipulating men, and shaping the underworld with unmatched precision. But exile was a subtle thief, stripping him of the immediate control he once wielded so effortlessly. Decisions that once required a word or gesture now had to pass through layers of intermediaries. Communication lagged, rival ambitions grew unchecked, and distance weakened the psychological grip that had once ensured loyalty without question. Slowly, cracks began to appear in the empire he had built, and the vulnerabilities of absence became painfully clear. Even the most loyal allies were affected. Meyer Lansky remained a masterful financial strategist, yet he could not fully replicate Luciano's authority over volatile personalities. Frank Costello, ever the diplomat, tried to mediate tensions, but his ability to enforce compliance was limited by Luciano's physical absence. Meanwhile, men like Vito Genovese quietly tested boundaries, exploiting opportunities that Luciano could observe but not always control in real time. Ambition, when unrestrained, became a subtle form of rebellion. The young bloods, emboldened by his distance, pushed the limits of authority, sometimes ignoring directives entirely, other times negotiating quietly behind the scenes to expand their own influence. The legal system, which had once seemed a secondary concern compared to street rivalries, reasserted itself with relentless pressure. Although Luciano had been deported years earlier, the American government remained determined to curtail his influence and prevent any resurgence. Law enforcement targeted his associates, investigated his operations abroad, and kept a watchful eye on the international channels he had painstakingly developed. In essence, the authorities sought to exploit his exile, turning it into a form of containment that threatened the continuity of the networks he had built. The constant scrutiny introduced risk not just of incarceration, but of irreparable damage to the delicate alliances he relied upon. It was during this period that betrayal, the ever-present specter in Luciano's life, began to loom large. Friends who had once been unwavering in loyalty now found incentives to reconsider allegiances. The distance created opportunities for secret deals, political maneuvering, and covert operations that bypassed his oversight entirely. Even the most carefully managed networks were susceptible to manipulation by outsiders, spies, or ambitious lieutenants eager to assert independence. The psychological weight of knowing that his influence could be subverted, even quietly, gnawed at Luciano. It was a subtle, corrosive form of danger, far more insidious than an overt attack, because it could emerge anywhere at any time, and with devastating effect. Meanwhile, health and age began to exact their toll. Years of stress, exposure to violence, and the psychological burdens of power had left Luciano physically and mentally fatigued. Exile intensified the isolation, compounding the strain on a man accustomed to constant engagement with the world he controlled. Nights were filled with reflection, and often with frustration, as he grappled with the reality that the empire he had shaped so meticulously could no longer be managed as directly or efficiently as before. The omnipotent figure who once moved through New York with absolute command now relied on correspondence, intermediaries, and the careful orchestration of a web of influence that could falter at any point. It was also during this period that Luciano's enemies consolidated. Vito Genovese, sensing weakness, orchestrated subtle moves to expand control, testing both the limits of power and the loyalty of men who remained aligned with Luciano. Each maneuver was a psychological probe, assessing how far men would go to protect, betray, or exploit the absence of their former leader. Other ambitious figures watched closely, learning from Genovese's tactics, and some began quietly positioning themselves to take advantage of Luciano's declining direct authority. The empire was resilient, but the cracks were becoming visible, and each crack invited the possibility of a fracture that could escalate into chaos. Personal relationships also suffered under the strain. Luciano's family, friends, and close associates experienced the tension of distance and political maneuvering. Trust, always a fragile commodity in his world, was further strained by uncertainty and fear. Even men who genuinely sought his guidance found themselves negotiating their own survival and advancement, creating layers of complexity that undermined the cohesion Luciano once took for granted. Every interaction, no matter how seemingly benign, carried implications for loyalty, power, and survival. Luciano's own reflections revealed the internal conflict of a man confronting decline. The awareness that he could no longer intervene directly in the American underworld weighed heavily. For decades, he had prided himself on foresight, cunning, and control. Now he was forced to accept limitations imposed by distance, law, and the inexorable movement of ambition. He began to understand that influence without presence was a precarious and fragile commodity. Each day became a careful balancing act, of asserting authority, guiding allies, deterring rivals, and monitoring the ever-present threat of betrayal. Yet even as his fall began, Luciano's strategic brilliance remained intact. He sought ways to mitigate risk, maintain influence, and preserve the networks he had built. He relied on the psychological power of reputation, subtle communication, and the careful orchestration of intermediaries to project authority. But the empire, no longer under his immediate command, was beginning to show signs of inevitable transformation. The young bloods, the ambitious rivals, and the vigilant law enforcement agents were all factors in a subtle, yet relentless, erosion of power. The fall, therefore, was not a single moment but a gradual unraveling, a combination of distance, ambition, betrayal, and legal pressure. Luciano's invincibility, once taken for granted, became increasingly contingent on factors beyond his control. The very mechanisms that had ensured the longevity of his empire were now being tested in ways he could not fully anticipate. And as he watched the unfolding dynamics from Naples, the reality settled in. Even the most brilliant strategist must eventually confront the fragility of power and the inevitability of change. The fall had begun, and the world Luciano had dominated was slowly, inexorably, moving beyond him. The trial that marked the next chapter of Lucky Luciano's downfall was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle that captivated the nation, a drama in which law, media, and underworld intrigue collided. By the time Luciano faced the courtroom, the man who had once walked the streets of New York as an untouchable kingpin was now reduced to a defendant, scrutinized not only for his past crimes but for the myth of his power. Headlines screamed his name, painting him alternately as a criminal mastermind, a public menace, or a man finally brought to justice. The trial became a theater in which reputation, influence, and fear were on trial as much as the man himself. The charges against him were severe: running a criminal empire, extortion, bootlegging, and various other offenses that spanned decades. Prosecutors meticulously laid out the architecture of organized crime, tracing every financial transaction, every extortion scheme, and every violent act back to the shadow of Luciano. Witnesses took the stand, some former associates now turned against him, others coerced by law enforcement, and each testimony contributed to a narrative that combined the brutality of street-level crime with the sophistication of an international network. Luciano's defense team faced a monumental challenge, countering not just evidence, but the cultural perception of him as the mastermind of America's underworld. The courtroom itself became a stage where psychology played as large a role as facts. Luciano, always aware of the power of perception, maintained a composed exterior, projecting the calm of a man who understood both the law and the limits of its reach. He listened carefully to witnesses, gauged reactions, and anticipated the moves of both prosecutors and adversaries. Even in the face of mounting evidence, he demonstrated the charisma and control that had once allowed him to dominate New York's criminal hierarchy. Yet beneath the surface, the stakes were immense. A conviction meant not only prison but the potential collapse of the networks he had worked decades to build. Media coverage amplified every nuance of the trial. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels portrayed Luciano as larger than life, the embodiment of organized crime itself. Public fascination was intense, blending fear, admiration, and morbid curiosity. The American public, still haunted by Prohibition-era violence and gangster legends, followed each hearing as if it were serialized drama. Each detail of testimony, each revelation about past crimes, was consumed voraciously, feeding the mythology of a man whose real power had long extended beyond the courtroom. Yet the media portrayal was double-edged. It cemented his legend while also influencing jurors and the public perception of guilt. As the trial progressed, the strategies of both sides became clear. Prosecutors aimed to demonstrate the continuity of Luciano's influence, emphasizing how his directives had orchestrated operations long after he was physically removed from New York. Every act of extortion, every illegal shipment, every instance of violence was presented as part of a coherent, deliberate design, a testament to his control. Defense attorneys countered with appeals to circumstantial evidence, challenges to witness credibility, and attempts to separate Luciano from the actions of others. Yet the weight of accumulated history, the pattern of behavior, and the sheer scale of the empire he had constructed created a narrative difficult to dispute. Witnesses, often former associates, became central to the drama. Men who had once obeyed Luciano now testified against him. Their motivations varied. Some sought leniency, some revenge, some were coerced by authorities. Their accounts painted a complex picture of loyalty and betrayal, power and intimidation. Each testimony revealed not only the operations of the underworld but also the intricate psychological web Luciano had woven. A world in which obedience was compelled not merely by fear of violence but by respect for a strategist whose intellect and vision few could challenge. The trial was not without tension behind the scenes. Luciano's associates worked feverishly to maintain control over their territories and ensure continued operation of their networks while their leader faced prosecution. Law enforcement monitored communications, intercepted messages, and sought to exploit any weakness that could tip the balance. Every decision, every word in the courtroom had ramifications far beyond the legal outcome. It was a struggle for the soul and continuity of organized crime itself. Public sentiment played a subtle yet powerful role. To many, Luciano represented the paradox of modern criminality, a man capable of both calculated brutality and visionary leadership. His ability to structure criminal enterprise like a business fascinated journalists and citizens alike. Some saw him as a villain finally caught. Others, particularly within immigrant communities, viewed him as a figure of survival and cunning in a society that often marginalized them. This complex perception added layers of difficulty for jurors, who were influenced not only by evidence but by the mythology surrounding the man before them. As closing arguments approached, it became evident that the trial had become more than a judicial proceeding. It was a narrative battle between myth and reality, between law and the enduring legacy of influence. Prosecutors had framed Luciano as a symbol of organized crime's dangers, insisting that his removal from society was essential to restoring order. The defense emphasized his absence from direct operations in recent years, portraying him as a man whose physical distance limited culpability. Yet both sides acknowledged, implicitly or explicitly, that the empire he had built could not be undone by a single conviction, that Luciano's shadow extended beyond the reach of the courtroom. The verdict, when it arrived, was the culmination of this tension. Conviction carried with it not only the weight of justice but the symbolic power of demonstrating that even the most untouchable figures could be held accountable. For Luciano, the sentence represented both personal defeat and the irreversible transformation of the empire he had forged. Yet it also highlighted the complexity of his influence. Networks remained operational, alliances endured, and his reputation, paradoxically, grew stronger as the world observed the fall of a man whose power had once seemed absolute. The trial, therefore, was more than a moment in legal history. It was a crucible in which the interplay of psychology, influence, and power was laid bare. It revealed the fragility of authority when distance, ambition, and law converged, and it marked a turning point in Luciano's life, the beginning of a period defined by exile, limitation, and reflection. Yet even in defeat, he demonstrated the strategic intelligence and resilience that had always defined him, maintaining a subtle grip on the networks and individuals that would continue to shape the underworld long after the gavel fell. Even behind the cold, iron bars of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence refused to fade. Confinement, which might have broken a lesser man, became instead another arena in which he exercised power, not through brute force or public displays, but through subtle psychological mastery and careful orchestration of his network. Within the walls of his cell, Luciano observed the delicate interplay of fear, respect, and ambition among both inmates and guards. He understood that authority was not always about presence. Often it was about perception. Men knew who he was and what he represented, and that knowledge became his shield, his currency, and his leverage. Luciano's reputation within the prison system preceded him. Wardens, guards, and fellow inmates were aware of the reach and ruthlessness he had commanded on the streets, and this awareness afforded him a measure of protection and deference. But he did not rely solely on legend. He engaged actively in the politics of prison life, forging relationships with influential figures who could facilitate communication, smooth tensions, and relay messages to the outside world. Every word spoken, every action taken, was calculated to maintain influence while minimizing risk. Even in captivity, Luciano was never truly powerless. His control was psychological as much as logistical. Outside the prison walls, his empire continued to operate, guided by directives sent through trusted intermediaries. Luciano had established a system of communication that relied on coded letters, discreet visits, and loyal lieutenants who understood the necessity of discretion. These channels ensured that decisions, instructions, and warnings reached the right people without exposing him to unnecessary legal jeopardy. In many ways, the distance imposed by incarceration allowed him to observe operations with greater clarity. Freed from the immediate chaos of street-level disputes, he could focus on strategy, timing, and the psychological levers that kept men aligned and compliant. Within the underworld, the perception of his continued authority was crucial. Allies understood that his knowledge extended beyond physical confinement. His network was structured to ensure that attempts at betrayal or overreach could be detected and addressed. Men obeyed not because they feared the walls that confined him, but because they feared the consequences of challenging a strategist whose mind was as formidable behind bars as it had been on the streets. This intangible power, the sense that Luciano's influence was omnipresent, became a cornerstone of his enduring authority. Luciano's daily life in prison was a study in disciplined routine. Hours were spent reading, reflecting, and corresponding with allies. Each day he assessed the state of his empire, evaluating the ambitions of allies and the maneuvers of rivals. He analyzed the movements of Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and others, noting patterns and anticipating potential conflicts. Even in confinement, he was a strategist at work, constantly refining plans, issuing guidance, and projecting control across distances and hierarchies. He also had to manage the human element within the prison. Fellow inmates included men of various criminal backgrounds, some of whom were ambitious and dangerous. Luciano's approach was a blend of respect, intimidation, and strategic alliances. By positioning himself as both a mentor and an authority figure, he ensured that his cell became a hub of influence. Minor conflicts were defused before escalating, alliances were nurtured, and information flowed in his favor. Every interaction reinforced the perception of power, demonstrating that even in confinement, Luciano's mind remained dominant. Outside observers often underestimated the scope of his influence during this period. Law enforcement assumed that incarceration would sever ties and diminish his reach, yet Luciano's careful orchestration proved otherwise. The systems he had built were resilient, designed to operate with or without his physical presence. Men like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello acted as extensions of his will, ensuring that operations continued smoothly and disputes were managed effectively. The perception of continuity, that Luciano remained the guiding hand, was as important as the reality. Luciano's time in prison also forced him to refine his understanding of human psychology. He observed fear, loyalty, ambition, and betrayal in a concentrated environment, learning which strategies elicited obedience and which encouraged resistance. He tested alliances, gauged reactions, and adjusted his influence accordingly. This period of confinement became, paradoxically, a laboratory for perfecting the art of control. The very limitations imposed upon him became tools for insight, allowing him to analyze the structures of power from a new vantage point. Even the legal pressures surrounding him reinforced his strategic approach. Luciano was acutely aware that the courts and law enforcement continued to monitor every interaction, every communication. This awareness necessitated an extra layer of caution, ensuring that his influence remained effective without providing prosecutors with new evidence against him. The balance of visibility and discretion was delicate, and he navigated it with the precision of a master strategist. By maintaining this level of influence, Luciano demonstrated that true power was not contingent upon freedom or physical dominance. His ability to command loyalty, orchestrate operations, and manipulate perceptions from behind bars reinforced the notion that his empire was built on intellect, psychological insight, and strategic foresight. The prison, intended to diminish him, instead became an arena in which the enduring qualities that had made him legendary were further refined. In essence, power behind bars was less about the tangible exercise of control and more about the intangible reach of influence. Luciano's genius lay in making men believe he remained omnipresent, that his judgment mattered, and that defiance carried consequences beyond the visible. His strategies ensured that the underworld continued to function according to his design, despite physical separation, legal restrictions, and constant observation. Through careful orchestration, disciplined thought, and psychological mastery, Luciano turned incarceration into a new form of strategic command, reinforcing his position as one of the most formidable figures in the history of organized crime. Luciano's deportation to Italy marked a profound turning point in his life, both physically and psychologically. After years of exercising near-absolute power in New York, the enforced removal from the streets he had ruled was a humbling, yet strangely liberating, experience. He arrived in Naples to a world simultaneously familiar and alien. The cobblestone streets, the accents of the people, and the rhythms of Sicilian life were home, yet the empire he had constructed in America existed now only in memory and through intermediaries. The physical distance imposed a new reality, forcing him to adapt from a man of immediate command to a strategist operating at the periphery, manipulating influence from afar. Italy offered a different kind of battlefield. The local mafia was fragmented, cautious, and deeply rooted in tradition. Luciano, who had revolutionized organized crime in the United States through structure, strategy, and psychological mastery, now faced the challenge of applying those lessons to a society resistant to change. He spent hours studying local dynamics, assessing potential allies and threats, and identifying young men whose ambition could be channeled into the global networks he envisioned. The shift required patience, diplomacy, and subtlety. Unlike New York, where fear and reputation were immediate tools, here influence had to be cultivated carefully, almost imperceptibly. Luciano's network in Europe became a focus for his attention. He cultivated relationships with Sicilian families, younger operatives, and key figures in southern Italy who had the ambition and skill to expand operations internationally. These were not merely criminal contacts. They were strategic partners capable of understanding the long-term vision of organized enterprise. Luciano's approach blended respect for traditional codes with the pragmatic strategies he had honed in America. Structured hierarchies, coordination across territories, and integration of legitimate businesses to mask illicit activity. He mentored these men, transmitting knowledge of logistics, negotiation, and psychological manipulation, ensuring that his influence extended far beyond Naples. Havana remained another critical node in Luciano's network. Though he could not return to the United States, the Cuban underworld, gambling unions, smuggling operations, still functioned under his guidance. Trusted intermediaries, often men who had operated under his command for decades, acted as extensions of his will. Letters, coded messages, and occasional personal visits ensured that directives were executed with precision. Even in exile, Luciano remained acutely aware that perception was as critical as action. The sense that he continued to oversee operations maintained loyalty and deterred rebellion. The exile years also prompted reflection. Removed from immediate danger and the ceaseless grind of street-level management, Luciano had time to consider the moral, philosophical, and personal dimensions of his life. He was a man who had risen from the chaos of immigrant streets to control one of the most formidable criminal empires in history, yet exile underscored the transient nature of power. Decisions that once seemed absolute were now mediated by distance, law, and circumstance. He confronted the reality that his influence, though enduring, was increasingly dependent on perception, loyalty, and the skill of others. Health and age began to weigh on him during these years. The physical demands of power, the stress of constant vigilance, and the years of exposure to danger left their mark. Yet he adapted, shifting focus from direct action to oversight and mentorship. The psychological aspects of influence became paramount. Knowing how to motivate, persuade, and sometimes intimidate from afar required a sophistication equal to, if not greater than, the raw authority he had exercised in New York. Luciano's mind became his primary tool, and in its use, he remained formidable. His philosophical transformation was subtle but significant. Whereas in New York power had been a daily exercise, measured in territory, money, and fear, exile prompted a more strategic perspective. Luciano began to view influence as a long game, one in which control could be exercised indirectly, subtly, and psychologically. He recognized the limits of human loyalty and ambition, adapting his methods to ensure resilience even when he was not present. In many ways, exile refined his genius, forcing him to consider networks, relationships, and operations in global terms rather than the immediate territorial focus of earlier years. Despite the distance, Luciano's vision remained ambitious. He sought to modernize crime on an international scale, linking Europe, the Caribbean, and the United States into networks that could operate with efficiency, discretion, and profitability. Narcotics, gambling, and smuggling became the connective tissue of a transnational empire. Yet these operations required delicate negotiation, balancing the ambitions of multiple actors, and respecting traditional hierarchies in Italy while asserting modern strategic practices. Luciano's skill at psychological insight, diplomacy, and risk management became more essential than ever. Even the emotional dimensions of exile were significant. The man who had thrived on visibility, command, and immediate influence had to adjust to a life of quiet authority, mediated through intermediaries and long-distance oversight. Moments of isolation prompted reflection on loyalty, betrayal, mortality, and legacy. Yet Luciano's resilience was evident. He did not succumb to despair or irrelevance. Instead, he transformed exile into a laboratory for strategy, mentoring, and the subtle orchestration of events that would ensure his continued relevance. In sum, exile marked both an end and a new beginning. The physical distance from New York curtailed direct power but expanded his strategic vision, compelling him to operate psychologically, diplomatically, and globally. Through mentorship, careful alliances, and management of perception, Luciano preserved his influence across continents. These final years were characterized not by the violence and spectacle of earlier decades, but by subtle mastery, strategic foresight, and a profound understanding of human ambition. Even in exile, he remained a central figure in the underworld, shaping its future with a mind as sharp and calculating as it had ever been. Luciano's legacy was vast, complex, and often misunderstood, a tapestry woven from power, strategy, innovation, and psychological mastery. He was not merely a criminal. He was a revolutionary architect of organized crime, a man who transformed what had previously been chaotic, street-level violence into a structured, sophisticated enterprise that could endure decades, continents, and generations. His genius lay not simply in the accumulation of wealth or territory, but in the creation of systems, hierarchies, and rules that allowed the mafia to function with efficiency, predictability, and resilience. Even after his exile, after trials, imprisonment, and the relentless pressure of rivals, his influence persisted, a testament to the enduring architecture he had built. The most significant aspect of Luciano's legacy was the establishment of the Commission, a governing body that formalized power, codified dispute resolution, and institutionalized the coordination of multiple criminal families. Before Luciano, organized crime in America was fragmented, violent, and unpredictable, with conflicts erupting over territory, personal grudges, or opportunistic ambition. Luciano's vision, inspired by both pragmatism and insight into human behavior, created a system in which power could be shared without constant bloodshed, and disputes could be managed with rules, negotiation, and consequence. The Commission was a radical innovation. It centralized authority while allowing autonomy, ensured accountability, and set the foundation for an empire that could adapt to changing times. Luciano's methods also modernized criminal enterprise. He treated illegal operations, gambling, narcotics, labor rackets, and smuggling, as business ventures requiring planning, oversight, and long-term strategy. His approach was meticulous, emphasizing risk management, diversification, and efficiency. He understood the importance of finance, political influence, and public perception, integrating these elements into his operations. Unlike the chaotic gangsters of previous eras, Luciano's organization was predictable in its structure but ruthless in its enforcement, a paradox that ensured both operational success and psychological dominance over rivals and allies alike. The psychological dimension of his legacy was equally profound. Luciano recognized that control was as much about perception, loyalty, and fear as it was about direct action. He mastered the art of influence, shaping behavior through strategic intimidation, mentorship, and subtle orchestration of events. Men deferred to him not only because of the power he wielded but because of the intelligence, foresight, and psychological acumen he displayed. Even in his absence, the memory of his presence shaped decisions, alliances, and rivalries. The empire continued to operate in line with his principles because the perception of his influence was woven into the very culture of organized crime. Luciano's transnational vision also redefined the reach of organized crime. Through carefully cultivated relationships in Cuba, Italy, and across the United States, he created networks that transcended borders. These connections allowed for coordinated operations in gambling, smuggling, and eventually narcotics, providing both profit and resilience. Luciano's influence was not limited to New York or even the United States. His strategies inspired and shaped criminal organizations globally. The integration of international connections into the operational framework of the Mafia was a direct product of his foresight, and it laid the foundation for modern transnational organized crime. Beyond operations, Luciano's legacy included a code, an implicit and sometimes explicit understanding of loyalty, discretion, and responsibility. The principles of omerta, respect, and strategic obedience were reinforced through his leadership. While fear was a tool, it was the combination of respect, incentive, and psychological influence that ensured compliance. Men knew that loyalty was rewarded, betrayal punished, and that success depended on both individual skill and alignment with the broader organizational strategy. Luciano institutionalized not only power but the culture of power, shaping behavior for generations of mobsters who came after him. Yet his legacy was not without contradiction. He was a man of brutality and vision, capable of both calculated murder and strategic mercy, of inspiring fear and fostering loyalty. To some, he was a villain. To others, a symbol of ingenuity and survival in a world where opportunity was scarce and ambition unrelenting. The mythology surrounding him, fueled by media, literature, and film, often blurred the lines between man and legend, creating an image larger than life. But beneath the myth was a reality of extraordinary intellect, foresight, and strategic genius. The influence of Luciano's methods extended far beyond his immediate empire. Future generations of organized crime leaders studied his strategies, replicated his hierarchical structures, and adapted his techniques for modern challenges. The patterns he established, centralized coordination, delegation of authority, conflict mediation, and international collaboration, became templates for criminal organizations worldwide. Even as law enforcement evolved, the principles he implemented allowed organized crime to endure, adapt, and often thrive. Philosophically, his legacy also invites reflection on the nature of power. Luciano demonstrated that true authority extends beyond physical dominance. It resides in strategy, psychology, and foresight. He showed that influence could be maintained across distance, that perception could equal reality, and that carefully constructed systems could outlast the lifespan of any individual. In many ways, Luciano's life was a lesson in the interplay of intellect and ambition, fear and respect, structure and adaptability, principles as relevant in boardrooms and politics as they were in the underworld. Ultimately, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is inseparable from the transformation of organized crime itself. He converted chaos into order, violence into structured enterprise, and ephemeral power into enduring influence. From the streets of New York to the docks of Havana and the neighborhoods of Naples, his methods reshaped the underworld. He left behind not just wealth or territory, but a system, a culture, and a psychological framework that would define organized crime for generations. In the annals of history, Luciano stands as a figure of paradox. Ruthless yet strategic, feared yet respected, a criminal visionary whose enduring influence continues to echo long after his death. Lucky Luciano's final years were marked by reflection, exile, and the subtle exercise of influence. Though physically distant from New York, his psychological control over the Mafia remained strong, as allies and rivals continued to operate within the systems he had built. Exile forced him to adapt, focusing on mentorship, strategic oversight, and long-distance management of operations across continents. His legacy is both practical and symbolic. He transformed chaotic street crime into organized enterprise, established the commission, and demonstrated that power relies as much on perception, loyalty, and intellect as on force. Even in decline, Luciano's life illustrates the enduring impact of strategic mastery, leaving an indelible mark on organized crime and the study of power itself.